The last time I was here in Ljubljana was 1988. What is important from that experience in 1988 through 1991, when I was traveling through most of Eastern Europe and living in Moscow for a little bit, is that wherever I went as a young American, there was an incredible optimism and sense of openness. People were hungry to talk and think about the way the world was changing for the better. Those were pretty heady times, and Francis Fukuyama, as many of you know, wrote The End of History. And whatever you think about his thesis, which is a little more complicated, it did seem at the time that liberal democracy had emerged victorious over quasi-totalitarian and repressive tyrannies in the Soviet bloc. So I'm speaking to you now in 2021, and the world feels quite different. I don't think I'm saying anything new here. Liberal democracies around the world are in crisis. Just 3 days ago in Washington, D.C., the U.S. President, Joe Biden, spoke of, in a speech, said that democracy around the world is in peril. What he means by that, and what I think a lot of people mean by that when they talk about the peril of democracy today, is a rise of authoritarianism or autocracy. And in the rise of authoritarianism or autocracy, you see a number of critiques. From the left, you see neoliberalism. From the right, you often see woke totalitarianism as a critique. Or from the populists, you see elitism. Or from the left, another left, racism. So all of these different critiques of democracy or the rise of authoritarianism are really, I think, of a common worry. They worry that there's a kind of nostalgic yearning for an older authoritarian relations of power, as my friend Henry Giraud once wrote a few years ago. I actually think that is the wrong worry. I don't think we're seeing a rise of authoritarianism around the world. I know that may seem surprising. I look at someone like Donald Trump and his experience, the experience we've had of him in the United States, as not about authoritarianism. The man had no theory, no ideology. He didn't really do anything authoritarian. He's a kind of nihilist, person who wants to, in a sense, revolt and break things up, but largely for his benefit and the benefit of people like him, but not with a strong authoritarian ideological tilt to it. At least that's my understanding, and I'm happy to talk more about it. And so I think the problem that we're facing is not one of authoritarianism, because to be authoritarian, you have to actually want to do something. You have to want to trample on people's rights, break the law, or abuse established rights. And I see Trump and many of the authoritarians around the world, like Orban and Erdogan, as more about maintaining their own power, petty tyrants, we might call them, or corrupt mafiosi is another way to put it, but not authoritarians, at least in that sense. I think what we are seeing is the extension of a long-standing crisis of authority. That's something quite different. So I think it's almost the opposite of authoritarianism. I don't think there's any authority, and I don't think Trump has authority, or Orban has authority, or Erdogan. I think that if you look at from the 1960s till today, you see that trust in the governments around the world are plummeting. The trust in media and the establishments are plummeting. The trust in intellectuals and experts are plummeting. And what we see is that all over the world, the elites, us, those who run things, run institutions, be it a university or an institute or a government, have failed to deliver on the promise of a better world. Public schools, I speak to the United States. I'm not, we have an international community here, so people can tell me where I'm wrong, although I hazard to think that I'm wrong in other places as well. But in the United States, public schools have not gotten better in the last 50 or 60 years, largely 5 decades run by experts and the best and the brightest. Healthcare has not gotten better, again, run by some of the best, most trained healthcare professionals in the world. Our legislature, more educated, more elitist than ever, has not gotten better. The whole model of educated expert government, I would argue, has failed to deliver on its promise. And the result of that around the world is anger, distrust, and resentment at these elites. For much of the industrial era and for much of the last 50 years, these elites were largely protected because of generally rising standards of living. People were doing better. And as they were doing better, they accepted elite control because they thought, all right, things are getting better. But as this feeling of prosperity has waned in the last 15 to 20 years, and as it's become increasingly clear that prosperity for people like us, or I'll speak for myself, people like me who travel around the world and go to conferences, has been quite positive. For many people in the world who don't travel around the world on a regular basis, who live in local communities, it has not. And so what we see is, I think, not authoritarianism, but a crisis of authority emerging, a kind of nihilism emerging around the world. We really do see a sense among many people that they don't know what would be better, but they know they want to tear what we have down. And that's what I think the world we're in right now is defined by. Authority, as Hannah Arendt understood it in her essay, "What is Authority?" is tantamount to she says the authority is what yields obedience based on a kind of hierarchy that's authoritative and is accepted. It can produce order without violence. That's the beauty of authority. Authority exists when someone commands and is obeyed, not because they're right, but because everyone recognizes their privilege of making such a claim. Only where there is authority, she says, can there be obedience in which men retain their freedom. So for her, authority is actually a necessary part of free government. Without authority, you can't have freedom. And so the problem we have today is not the return of authoritarianism, at least as I understand it. It's the loss of authority as a political phenomenon. And at the root of this loss of authority, before I speak a little bit about the council system that lost the promise in my title, I want to sort of step back and say that at the root of this loss of authority is an existential experience, which I think very much defines the last 100 or so years of much of the Western world, and we might think other parts of the world as well, which is loneliness. Loneliness, which Arendt defines as a kind of feeling of abandonment, a homelessness, a rootlessness, a worldlessness. It begins, she says, with the shattering of collective dreams and common hopes. We tell stories of hope, be it a religious story about salvation, or a national story about who we are, identity, our clan, our politics. And when we lose those hopes that we are of who we are, it's like a loss of dreams. And for Arendt, this loss comes about for a whole host of reasons, but it has its actualization in the break, which he calls the break of tradition, the break of the pillars of tradition, the loss of religion and tradition and nationhood as things that give us a sense of identity and hope and promise in the world. And it was on the basis of this feeling of purposelessness, loss, hopelessness, loneliness, that she argues that totalitarianism was a novel solution to the problem. I mean, that's, I think, one of the most important and radical insights that Arendt offers, is that totalitarianism was a successful solution to the problem of loneliness. It was a positive in that sense. It answered the needs of Western humanity better than monarchy, better than aristocracy, and better than democracy at the time. And the reason it did so is because it promised to give people again a kind of coherent narrative, a sense of meaning and purpose in their lives, that there is one coherent fiction, a totalizing fiction, that will say that we are the Aryans, or in Russia, the Bolsheviks are the chosen people, and we can and we will participate in the world in a way that is that brings meaning and purpose and dignity to the world. Obviously, she didn't like the totalitarian solution, but she thinks you can't ignore its success. At the end of in the epilogue to her book Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt says that totalitarianism may have left us, but the problem that gave birth to it, namely metaphysical loneliness or homelessness, purposelessness, has stayed, and that there will be and need to be new solutions, which could be just as dangerous or maybe even potentially worse than totalitarianism. I don't think she ever fully decides this, but I think that by the mid to late 1960s, she has come to the conclusion that the successor to totalitarianism as the effort to address the problem of modern loneliness is experts and bureaucracies in government. She comes to see experts and bureaucrats, what she calls the rule of nobody, as potentially more dangerous than even totalitarianism, because the real danger of the rule of nobody, of a rule of bureaucrats, is that there's when a bureaucrat takes away your freedom, or when a bureaucrat tells you what to do, there's actually nobody to respond to, because there's no person. It's an office, and you don't know who to respond to. And if you respond to one office, they say, "Oh no, it's actually the other office that's responsible." And if they say we go to that office, they say, "Oh well, no, the window's closed. Go back to the first office." And the bureaucrats are part of a managerial class, what some people now call a professional managerial class, that has its own prejudices, right? That wants to maintain its power and control, and that these and they claim not to be interested. They claim to be neutral in the Weberian sense of value neutrality of bureaucratic expertise, and yet these experts are hardly neutral, and have begun to rule, and we trust them with rule. We crave expert rule because precisely they claim to be value neutral. They claim to be objective. So I want to just use the example that we're all painfully aware of the last year and a half of COVID and the COVID pandemic and the COVID crisis. There has been, again, I think I'll speak for the United States, but I think this is somewhat of a worldwide phenomenon. There has been an absolute veneration of experts. In the United States, we have someone who is personified as Dr. Anthony Fauci. And people want to know what to do. And if the experts say shut down, we shut down. If the experts say wear a mask, wear a mask. If they don't wear a mask, we don't wear a mask. And there's this kind of veneration of these experts. I'm sure some of you and so we're desperate for these experts, and yet the experts got it all wrong. I mean, over and over again over the last year and a half, they've been wrong. Now, that's not a critique of them as experts. It's almost of definition. Science works by building on knowledge. We didn't know much about this at the beginning. And when we began the pandemic, we knew very little about the coronavirus. We didn't know how it traveled, how contagious it was. And yet these experts came out there and made these proclamations, told us what to do, and people wanted it. When people disputed the experts, for example, like President Trump, people got very upset, called them anti-science. When Giorgio Agamben disputed the experts, people got very upset. I don't know how aware people are of Giorgio Agamben's 3 essays back in March and April of last year. in which he argued that we were giving up our freedom to scientific experts. And he said, who put the experts in charge of our hierarchy of values, right? This is the question Agamben asked in 3 essays he wrote that caused a lot of controversy last year. You know, who is to tell us that we put the lives of people above religion? Who is to tell us that we put people's health above their dignity and their livelihoods? Who's to say that we would rather have public health be preserved than have friendship and nearness and proximity in our lives? Who's to say that old people and elderly people in homes or in hospitals must die alone rather than with their loved ones in order to protect them and their loved ones, right? Well, we know who's to say. It's the public health administrators and public health bureaucrats. And Agamben questioned this and questioned it pretty severely, and was, as I'm sure many of you know, roundly criticized for it. And yet his critique is a very Arendtian critique, right? It's a critique that says that we have increasingly set life, the value of life, above other values, be it appearing, working, thinking, action, friendship, other values. And look, that's part of politics, is making these decisions. What I think I'm interested in is the way not that we have to make these decisions about our values. That's, to me, absolutely imperative. But it's that we are so paralyzed and unable to make decisions about our values that we have turned and basically abdicated our rights to make these decisions to experts, on the idea that experts are the ones who know best how to run a society. So I want to just say a few things about experts. Philip Tetlock, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, in 2011, organized numerous teams of experts: CIA, academics, FBI, people from all over the world, intelligence agencies, the best experts in the world, and had them make predictions about certain political, social, and other phenomena. And then he brought 300 people together, 3,000 volunteers together, and he had them make predictions and talk to each other. And he picked the best 4 or 5 of them, and he made a team out of these total non-experts. And the non-experts so profoundly beat the experts over and over again in making predictions. They beat them so badly that the Washington Post, who wrote about it, said that they were not allowed to print how badly they beat them because it was classified information. And it would be detrimental to the interest of the United States to show how uninformed our experts were. What the volunteer forecasters did, and the reason they were successful, according to Tetlock, is that they shared information. They questioned each other. They asked, "Are you sure? How do you know that?" And that seems sort of obvious, right? He says they had dragonfly eyes. They looked with lots of eyes, with tens of thousands of lenses. And they demonstrated what he called open active mindedness, or active open-mindedness. And it seems pretty obvious. But why didn't the experts do that? Because the experts thought they knew it. The experts were caught up in theories, caught up in knowledges that they were positive were true, right? They knew that this was true or that was true. And as a result, they didn't stop and ask each other basic questions. Dan Kahan, who's a former colleague of mine at Berkeley, but now at Yale, argues that scientifically literate adults are much more likely to become dogmatic about politically polarizing topics in science, much more so than your everyday people. Why? Well, because scientifically literate adults are very good at one thing, right? Rationalizing. theorizing, abstracting, and thus ignoring facts that run counter to their opinions and beliefs. They're incredibly good at not seeing the truth and using theory to hide the truth. And this becomes the topic of a number of essays Hannah Arendt wrote in the 1960s. I mean, I'll just Lying in Politics, where she talks about the Vietnamese, the American experts in Vietnam, Home to Roost, the last speech she ever gave on violence, and a number of others. And these are topics she becomes incredibly pessimistic about and worried about the power of experts. She actually ends up saying that the greatest threat to liberal freedoms today is the entrance of experts into government. It's an extraordinary claim that she makes. And I think, and so why do experts come into government? Well, I think it's because in a world of loneliness, right, we don't have the meanings that we need. We don't have the purpose. And so we actually are perfectly happy to outsource our ethical and our moral and our meaningful pursuits to those who claim to be able to do it better than us. And as long as the experts are believable, that world can last. And I think that the last 50 or 60 years have seen that world at its apex. And I think that world is crumbling before our eyes right now. I'm going to tell a story that was told in a book that came out a year and a half ago by William Davies called Nervous States. It's one of the books that's made a huge impact on me in the last year in my thinking. And nervous states is a word, nervous states, that Davies uses to name the feelings and nerves that are irrational in the world. So here's the story he tells, and I think it's a convincing story, but I'm happy to hear you critique it. He says that the 17th century was a period of crisis, right? There was the 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, which set up our nation-state system. And it's not an accident that the great thinker writing of it this time is Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes offered the liberal solution to this crisis, the loss of authority, in the religious authority, traditional authority, certain kind of Aristotelian rational authority. And Hobbes says that out of fear, we give up our rights to our own feelings and self-interest to one sovereign who represents a common interest. In a way, this is the beginning of expert governance, right? Liberal, bureaucratic expert governance. The idea is, in order to prevent chaos and out of fear, we let one expert, the sovereign, the Leviathan, rule. That's a well-known story. But the interesting part of the story that Davies writes about is the relation between Hobbes and the Royal Society, the Society of Scientists and Social Scientists and Engineers that emerges in London and is founded by Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle founds the society around the same time as Hobbes is writing to, quote, institutionalize experimental methods of natural science. And these scientific methods sought to make sense, objective sense of the world. But very quickly, the Royal Society started to bring into its ranks not natural scientists, but social scientists, people like William Petty, who developed a system of hospital patient records to allow doctors and newly emergent public health records and officials to discover correlations between diseases and their causes. He brought in people who would work for the Bank of England and developed record-keeping techniques to convince financiers that the bank could be trusted to keep and honor their debts. We hold your money. We have to show you that we're keeping the debts correctly. And the idea is that the Royal Society of England began to develop techniques and methods to develop trust in science, to develop the idea that people should trust the scientists. And these new technocrats, these new social scientists, sought to achieve, like Hobbes did, security through science. They sought to create better systems of health, better systems of finance, better system of roads, better systems of schooling. And they did it by creating what they called communities of expertise, a new intellectual culture that emerged around using objective mathematical languages and technical languages that would be free from opinion and free from influences and a kind of political geometry. Now, interestingly enough, Hobbes was very suspicious of this, of the Royal Society. He didn't think much of it, and they didn't invite him to join, and he refused, and he would not join. He was very critical, and the point he criticized was that in order to build communities of trust, you basically had to be privileged elites. You had to be of the same social, political, ethical, economic background. And what Hobbes says is that there's no way to create objective knowledge of social, of human behavior, because we're different. The only way to do it, he says, is to let some sovereign do it and let their will stand for it. But what the Royal Society wanted to do is, in a sense, soften that, not make it so positivist, not make it so autocratic, but say that we can create an objective knowledge. And it's this ideal of expertise that Hobbes criticized that Davies argues, and I think rightfully so, has emerged post-World War II as the replacement for totalitarianism, in a sense that it has become the way that lonely, purposeless people are able to accept a unified, coherent meaning in society, not because it represents a particular viewpoint, but because it's supposed to be efficient or objective, or so we have this whole alphabet soup, right? The IMF, the UN, Bretton Woods, the World Bank, the GATT tariff on trades, the WHO, all of these groups, and this is now, and now with the internet we have Yelp, so that where it used to be you had restaurant reviewers who would come and I have a perfect palate, or my wine review, and I have a perfect palate. Now, millions of people review restaurants, and we trust them more than we trust the Michelin Guide or some reviewer. And so there's an attack. What we see happening right now is an attack on experts, an attack on the idea that there are these experts with expertise, and an increasing awareness of what I call the prejudices of experts, or the prejudices of the professional class. These experts think that there's things we ought to think versus what people think. They think that we can scientifically classify and make reality conform to standards of behavior. As Bertrand Russell wrote, they have a pleasure in planned construction. Experts want to think that the world will fit their models or their theories. And so Hannah Arendt, as I said, and I think this is in a number of her essays that I mentioned before, Lying in Politics, primarily, along with Home to Roost and On Violence. She talks about the way that talking heads and experts and bureaucrats have plausible theories. And from these plausible theories, they develop their facts of what they think is going to happen. And they forget then that they were theories, and they think they're facts. And they think, oh, well, the domino theory is true. Or, oh, well, coronavirus is spread by germs on surfaces. Oh, well, no, it's not. It's spread by the air. Oh, well, it's spread inside or outside. And, sometimes they have some accuracy. Sometimes they're wrong. But what she says is these provisional theories, these plausible theories are all dominated by one overarching prejudice, which is really the overarching prejudice of all experts: internal consistency. They believe that the world is supposed to make sense, follow laws, and that the whole premise of what an expert is someone who knows those laws, or who's schooled and exercises in social science laws, whether it's supply and demand or some other one. And so these experts begin to assert their view of reality over and against the view of reality of the people. And they say that our reality is civilized, it's rational. And what Davies is arguing, William Davies is arguing, is in this day and age, in the early 21st century, the claim to expert authority and expert opinion is simply no longer feasible. We have, and we use an expression in English, jump the shark. I don't know if that's familiar here, but no, if you make the claim that you're an expert, people will laugh at you today. Largely, we all need experts, and yet the experts are seen as the butt of jokes over and over again around the United States, and I think increasingly around the world. And so what you have now is a bunch of experts, whether it's in academia or whether it's in health science or whether it's in education, who want to maintain their power. And Hannah Arendt quotes Tocqueville from his first book on the aristocracy in France, not democracy in America, at the beginning of The Origins of Totalitarianism. And what she says is, when people turn against a class in power, it's not because the class in power is powerful, and it's not because they're rich, and it's not because they hurt people or do injustice. It's because their power is no longer justified. And the aristocrats in France at the time of the French Revolution still had power, but that power was no longer seen as justified. They didn't know why should they have it. The bourgeoisie was more important to them. And what I think we're seeing right now around the world is that the experts still want to claim the right to rule, whether it's in parliaments or congresses or health organizations. And increasingly, people simply don't trust them. And every expert story is questioned, is challenged, debated, picked over, whether it's on global warming or on COVID, and people simply don't trust it. And so we have a kind of chaos that has emerged. And what we've seen now is that the world has divided itself into two races. This is going to be the most controversial claim. It's a claim that Arendt makes in a footnote that no one reads to her essay on violence. And in that footnote to the essay on violence, she says that the coming rule by intellectuals, which is what she thinks is happening, by experts and intellectuals, is bound together with the centralization of power that causes the drying up or oozing away of all authentic power sources in the country. She calls this praxis Entzug in the main text of On Violence. And what she then says is that it is the resentment against intellectuals and technocrats and the centralization of power that they make possible that is the source of increasing ethnic nationalism in this country. She wrote this in the 1960s. What she's saying is that the rise of a new nationalism is going to be aimed at intellectuals, aimed at the experts. I think that's exactly what's going on now, 60 years after she wrote this essay, or 55 years after she wrote it. She says that the repressed animosity and resentment against intellectuals may well, quote, harbor all the murderous traits of a racial antagonism, as distinguished from mere class conflicts, inasmuch as it too will concern natural data which cannot be changed, hence a condition from which one could liberate oneself. What she means is that the new racism is going to be a racism, on the one hand, between the intellectuals who see the rest as deplorable, to use a word that has been big in the United States, and the rest of the people who see the intellectuals as elites, out of touch, woke, totalitarians. And she says that her last line of this footnote is that the danger of demagogues, of popular leaders, will be so great that the meritocracy will be forced into tyrannies and despotism. That the meritocracy will have to, in a sense, turn itself into a tyranny of despotism in order to prevent the demagogues from taking power. I think that's the current war that we're seeing around the world, a war between the meritocracy and the demagogues. Which brings me to my hopeful part of my talk, which is that, Christina talked earlier about councils, and I have always found the what Arendt says about councils very moving and provocative, but not very practical or helpful right now. And yet there is a new movement that's going on around the world that I have become involved in, called citizen assemblies, or sortition. Sortition was a word I didn't even know about 3 or 4 years ago, and suddenly it sort of rocketed to a lot of people's attention. But it basically means government by lottery. For those who don't know, throughout history, democracies were not elected. In fact, the first electoral democracy was the United States of America. Throughout history, democracies were always chosen by lot, the representatives. And for Aristotle, for Montesquieu, for Rousseau, for many others, it was just an obvious fact that democracy would choose its representatives by lottery, aristocracies would choose them by election. The reason being that election would choose prejudiced people who have a prejudice of the status quo, people who have a prejudice of a certain class, who had knowledge, who were experts. And so the idea of sortition and the sortition movement that I'm interested in, and that we're holding a big conference on in October at the Arendt Center at Bard, is to create meaningful, empowered bodies that have actual legislative power. So you asked Christina, I forget your name, but you asked Christina about whether these councils can make law or not, right? What's your name again? Tushan, right? And interestingly enough, there was just a council that happened in France this year during the pandemic, where 168 people were brought together, and 150 randomly selected citizens for 7 weeks over 9 months. And they met for 7 weeks over 9 months together, 7 weekends over 9 months, with experts, with lawyers, with other people, and actually wrote legislation. And from everyone I've talked to and the experts that have talked about it, the legislation they wrote was incredibly sophisticated, thoughtful, and also novel. It wasn't what was expected. It brought in the dragonfly eyes, right? That Tetlock talks about. It brought in people looking from unexpected perspectives, people who were not experts. They talked to experts, they heard from experts, they could question experts, but they weren't the experts themselves. And they, over these 9 months, wrote up and made legal proposals. President Macron had promised that these would be then voted upon in the French Parliament, and he's trying to backtrack on that because they go against some entrenched interests. But it does strike me that what Helene Landemore, who's studied this and who's speaking at our conference and teaches at Yale, and is, I think, one of the really smart people writing about these issues, what she says is that what studying this has proven to her is that everyday people working together, organized, and with the ability to call in and bring and call upon experts, but not be in any way beholden to experts, can actually productively, originally, and in a way that's innovative and also participatory, legislate in ways that I think most people still don't believe, because most people still have the prejudice that experts have a kind of knowledge which is needed to make political decisions. And this is something that Arendt denied throughout her writing, right? That there is no expertise in politics. And I think these citizen assemblies, something she never conceived of. It's interesting enough, she wrote so much about the Greeks. As far as I know, she never wrote about the fact the Greeks governed through sortition, through lottery. It just didn't come up in her work. And yet, to me, it fits so perfectly with her work that I see it as the most exciting spiritually Arendtian solution we can find. I'll end because it's 5:45. I'll end just by saying that one of the books that was most meaningful to Arendt was Tocqueville's other book, his great book, Democracy in America. And in that book, Tocqueville says that the most important institution supporting American democracy is the civil jury, right? The jury in civil law. Why is that? He says it's not because the civil jury will make the right decisions or the wrong decisions. It's not because they're more just or unjust. He says the civil jury is important because it teaches people practical intelligence and good sense, and it's highly beneficial because it teaches them how to be a citizen. It teaches them how to sit down with others and talk about matters of right and wrong and make decisions. The jury system still exists in the United States. It's one of the only countries that still uses a jury system, although it's become increasingly technocratic and exclusionary. The idea that we can exclude all sorts of people from juries in the name of justice, I think, is actually a mistake in the end. But these citizen counts, these citizen assemblies, or as I like to refer to them, citizen juries, are another way. The argument is not necessarily that they'll make the right decisions about the climate or about race relations or about abortion or whatever they're used for, although they seem to make pretty good ones. The argument is that they actually are a school for citizenship. They're a school for how to be a political citizen. And they're also a response to and a rejection of the increasing tyranny of expertise that we have in our country and I think around the world. And I think that if we're going to, if I'm right, that we're in sort of the midst of a new war, a race war between intellectuals and everyone else, between experts and everyone else, between those with expert prejudices and those without them. Citizen juries, I think, offer one of the few ways forward as a way of bringing these two groups together in an institutional setting that allows them to speak to each other and develop a politics that is informed both by experts and by non-experts, average people. So, as I said, this is I'm happy to talk a little bit about that if you're interested in it. We're having the first major conference in the U.S. in a humanities forum on civil juries in October. I'm very excited about that, and thank you all for listening, and I'm thrilled to be here.